Good afternoon. I am Allison Kemmerer, the Addison's Interim Director and Mead Curator of Photography and Senior Curator of Contemporary Art. I'm delighted to introduce Kim Sichel, our guest speaker today, although guest is hardly the right word, as Kim is part of the Addison family, both as a longtime member of our advisory board and for two members of the staff, myself and curatorial fellow Tessa Height. Kim is a former professor and an ongoing mentor. It was actually a seminar on documentary photography that Kim taught at BU that first opened my eyes to photo history as a field of study and really set me on the path of becoming a photo curator. So for me, it's an honor to be introducing her. Of course, those connections are just icing on the cake, and that's not why Kim is here today. She is here as an authority on photographic history. With a BA from Brown University and an MA and PhD from Yale University, Kim is Associate Professor of the History of Photography and Modern Art at Boston University. She teaches photo history and European and American modernism with a particular interest in photographic books, photojournalism, and documentary photography. Kim has served as chair of the Department of the History of Art and Architecture, as director of the American and New England Studies program, and as director of the Boston University Art Gallery while at BU. She has received fellowships from the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Radcliffe Institute at Harvard University, and the Boston University Center for Humanities. She is the author of numerous books, essays, articles, and exhibition catalogs. Her most recent book, the focus of our talk today, is Making Strange, the Modernist Photo Book in France, published by Yale University Press this year. Her 1999 book, Germaine Krull, Photographer of Modernity, which accompanied the first major retrospective of Krull's work, was published by MIT Press and was a finalist for the Krasna-Krauss Foundation's Best Photographic History Book. Additional publications include To Fly, Contemporary Aerial Photography, 2007, Germaine Krull, Monte Carlo, 2006, Street Portraits, 1946 to 1976, the photographs of Jules Ahrens in 2003, Brassai, Paris le Jour, Paris la Nuit, 1988, From Icon to Irony, German and American Industrial Photography in 1995, and Black Boston, Documentary Photography and the African American Experience in 1994. She's also written essays about photographers Lee Friedlander, André Kertész, New Topographics, Interwar European Photography, and European Women Photographing in Africa. Quite a lot, and that is not the full comprehensive list. As most of you know, or many of you may know, Robert Frank's The Americans is currently on view at the Addison. We reopened about 2 weeks ago, and we are open to the public on Fridays through Sundays. So I hope all of you who are local or somehow will be in this area will be able to see the show in person. It's up through April 11th. Also about the Americans, in considering what we would do for programming for the exhibition, we thought about the Americans is recognized as one of the most important American photo books of the 20th century. So in thinking about public programming, we immediately thought of Kim because of her expertise on photo books. But we also thought of her because of her new book, which discusses the golden age of photo book production in France from the late 1920s to the late 1950s. And as many of you know, The Americans, although considered an American photo book, was first published in Paris in 1958. So Kim's book gives us the opportunity to consider this seminal series within the less talked about context of European art and influence. So I see this event as a twofer, an exhibition-related educational program, but also a celebration and maybe even a book launch for what is a beautiful and insightful publication. I hope if you don't have a copy, you will all get one. It's an incredible book. We're so happy to have Kim here, and I can't wait to dive in. But before I do, just a little housekeeping. After Kim presents, we'll have time for questions and answers. So we invite you to type in your questions in the Q&A, not the chat. We're going to be using the Q&A option. You can type them in as we go and as they come to you, or you can type them in after she finishes. I will monitor that and read them aloud to Kim, and we'll answer as many as we can. So now, without further ado, I am happy to introduce Kim Sichel.
Okay. Thank you, Allison, for that wonderful introduction and for inviting me to speak today and to celebrate photo books in general and Robert Frank in particular in conjunction with my new book, Making Strange and the Modernist Photo Book in France. I'm going to put up my images so that we can share some pictures to look at. Thank you. All right, sorry about that. All right, so this is the cover of The Americans and the first image from the book, which you see over here on the right. First of all, the Addison Gallery is open right now, and you have a chance to go and see the photographs on view, every single photograph in The Americans in sequential order, which is really great. Second, the installation of these books shows on the wall how you would walk through the book if you were reading it. And the image on the right from Hoboken opens up the book. It's the first image. A cut-off flag, truncated people, and dark brickwork set the tone for The Americans. The installation of all the images in the book at the Addison allows us to walk through its progression from one to the next to see the particular kind of language that sequenced images and photo books can make. The Americans, which appeared in 1959 in the United States, is one of the two most famous photo books in American 20th century history. The other is Walker Evans's book, American Photographs, published 2 decades earlier in 1938. Many people have paired these two books and seen a lineage from Evans's book to Frank's and beyond. And you can see the cover here and the layout of the book. This is a very American definition of Frank's book, to look only at Evans. And it's certainly true that Frank's subject is America, famously a dark, pessimistic, poetic view of the 1950s with a bleak view of American culture, racism, and anguish. It was widely panned when it came out in the United States in 1959 at the height of the Cold War. Each of the 4 sections of the book begins with a flag image. One flag image you already saw. Here's a second one. As you can see in this one of the 4th of July, these images are not patriotic or boosterist images, but instead they show the fragility of the American flag. And you see that in the first image as well. And in the photograph on the right from The Americans of a Black nurse or nanny stoically standing with her white charge in Charleston, South Carolina, fading into the terribly white streetscape behind her, is one of the most searing images that we have of the complicated race relations in the United States. However, there's another story, which is that both Evans and Franks have strong links to the French photo books that were produced between 1928 and the mid-1950s, and I'll hope to share that story with you today. Fewer people know about the photo books of Germaine Krull, Brassai, Cartier-Bresson, even if their names are well known in the United States, but they were hugely important for Europeans and Americans alike, and the photographic publishing scene in France reverberated across the United States and around the world. Robert Frank's American edition of his book is the epitome, along with Evans's book, of what we normally think of in modernist photo books in the United States: a blank white page on the left-hand side and a single image on the right. The image floats in a sea of white as if it were hanging on the walls of a modernist museum, isolated from words, context, politics, and culture in general. In Jack Kerouac's words, Frank has sucked a sad poem out of America. In fact, this book, with the construction of a white page on the left and a single image on the right, is a convention common to the Museum of Modern Art and not one that is the norm outside of the United States. The original story of Frank's book is much more complicated, as it was first published in 1958 and not until the following year, 1959, in the United States. And I'm showing you here the American cover, which you all are quite familiar with, I'm sure, on the left, and the French cover on the right from 1958. The original story of Frank's book is much more complicated. Frank, a Swiss-born Jewish artist who was a student during World War II, first came to the US in 1947. He traveled to Peru in 1948 and lived in Paris from 1949 to 52. After his return to the United States, he won a Guggenheim Foundation Fellowship to travel around the country in 1955 and 1966, photographing with increasing despair what he saw as a racist, hostile country. Frank turned to Robert Delpire, a Parisian friend since 1952, to publish the book in France. He couldn't find a publisher in the United States at first. He wanted to avoid double images on page spreads, which would have been a norm for French books and for Delpire, and Delpire agreed. The cover, however, was a Saul Steinberg drawing of a New York sidewalk, presenting a much more humorous view than the famous black, bleak New Orleans trolley car of the later American edition. But most dramatically, or equally dramatically, the interior of the book, of the French book, as you can see on the right, was full of texts by a variety of authors, including an editor, the Belgian critic Alain Bosquet, by the 19th century author of Democracy in America, Alexis de Tocqueville, and by many American writers ranging from Walt Whitman to Franklin Delano Roosevelt to John Steinbeck to Adlai Stevenson. In the beginning texts, Bosquet makes a 6-page long list of stereotypes of American behavior. And here's the first image of the book on the right. And here is the beginnings of Bosquet's long list. Bosquet suggests Americans, you don't have to carry an ID card. Americans are rude. They drink to excess. They only have menus with pictures of the food on their menus, yet they're not snobbish. Those are the kinds of stereotypes that Bosquet publishes. None of them have anything to do at all with the picture which you see here on the right-hand side. And across from the last page in the book, depicting Robert Frank's wife, Mary, and their children in a car in Texas, down here in the bottom left, we read Adlai Stevenson's debate comment before he lost the 1952 presidential election against Eisenhower. Again, no connection to Mary Frank in her car. The texts and images together form an anthropological overview of Americans, full of French generalizations and other received opinions. In this way, the book fits neatly into the anthropological series that Delpire was editing. Among several dozen other Delpire books are volumes on Peru, also with photographs by Robert Frank, on Arabs, on Germans by photographer René Burri, on China with images by Henri Cartier-Bresson, on Seville, on Japan, on the Sudan, and so on. Frank's book in this context is one of a series of ethnographic round-the-world tours rather than a standalone tale. Frank disliked the French texts in this French edition, and Delpire agreed to remove them in future editions of the book. The absence of the famous Jack Kerouac afterword from the American edition, however, was not an accident. Delpire said no one in France had ever heard of Kerouac, and his text would not have sold a single copy in France. The French edition of Robert Frank's book is one example of the importance of France for photo book publishing, and as we'll see, there are many more. So now I'll turn to my own book and the explorations that I've made of French photo books. The story of modernist French photo books is the topic of my new book, Making Strange, the Modernist Photo Book in France. It begins in 1928, around the time when Walker Evans began to make photographs, and it ends with Robert Frank, who in fact, as you saw, just first published his book in 1958 in Paris. The structure of my book is to give a deep read of one or two photo books for each decade to see the different strategies at work. I'll introduce you to Germaine Krull's book, Metal or Métal, full of 1920s montage and fragmentation, to Brassai's Paris de Nuit, with its 1930s dream detectives, to Pierre Jaon's La Mort et les Statues, dealing with World War II mourning and loss, and using an idea like historian Pierre Nora's Sites of Memory, to Cartier-Bresson's The Decisive Moment, engaging with nostalgia and estrangement at the end of the colonial era in France, and also with West and non-West cultures in the Cold War. And I fit Frank into that trajectory as well as the last chapter of my book. And as we have seen, it was originally seen in a context of anthropological photo books, not an American exceptionalist book. The larger points that I try to promote in the book are as follows. Photographic books, which you hold in your hands, are a three-dimensional experience. They're haptic, they're material. They're quite different from viewing a framed photograph on the wall behind you. I study photo books through the lens of materiality as three-dimensional objects that respond to the sense of touch as well as sight. If you hold a photo book in your hand, you can turn it, you can hold it up to your nose, you can look at it backwards or frontward, any way you want. In addition, photo books are sequential. So the progression of one image after the next, rather than a single image, sequence matters a lot. Especially in the 20th century, modernist photo books create new nonverbal narratives, quite different from the travel albums, diaries, science notebooks, and family albums that dominated the 19th century. Versions of these older forms sometimes persist in modernist books. Frank's books, for instance, is a travel album at its core, although it's a much transformed one. Text and image relationships are key in these books. Words can change the image's meaning completely, and images can also change the meanings of words. Captions add a third dimension to this, and it's a mistake to assume that the three kinds of contents, image, caption, and text, are always in sync with one another. Sometimes they're contradictory. And then you add graphic design and book design, which is a cultural language in itself that also needs to be factored in. Books are a collaborative effort, often actively involving a photographer, a textual author, a caption writer, a graphic designer, and a publisher. Even the printer matters. The modernist photo books I study are often printed in photogravure, occasionally in a process called collotype as well. Both of these techniques are richer and more immediate than the grid-based offset lithography, which has become the norm for photographic photo books in contemporary times. All of these actors have important roles to play in constructing the cultural artifact of the book itself. Books are also democratic. They're not terribly expensive. They're a lot less expensive than buying a photographic print then and now, and they can move from reader to reader. These books are not precious small editions. They're part of a mass market. Each person reads a photo book differently. Unlike a novel where you have to follow the author in a certain direction, in a photo book, you can go back to front, open the book in the middle, and so on. And the books are also excellent international travelers, especially for these modernist books. The images carry the brunt of the message, so they're comprehensible for people in many countries with many different languages. They're also small enough to be easily transported for sale elsewhere, or as a gift or a souvenir from one culture to the next. These books traveled all around the world. They're also good time travelers. Books from a century ago exist today, less fragile than single photographs, and their meanings can change over time. They have long and rich social lives that span long periods of time. You might wonder about my name, Making Strange, which you can see here on the cover, and even about these bronze alligators who are so dramatically adorning the cover of the book. These creatures are from the World War II book by Pierre Jahan, and I'll tell you much more about that later. But the concept of making the world seem strange has multiple resonances from the 1920s through the 1950s, ending with Frank's book, which makes America strange in an anthropological sense, very different from Europe. Modernist artists in the 20th century reveled in cacophony and disorientation, and rather than trying to order it, the photographers who made these books follow that model of reveling in disorientation. The Russian formalist writer Viktor Shklovsky developed an estrangement theory, defamiliarizing objects as a way of enlivening his subjects. I refer to that in talking about these books, and also to the Soviet montage films of modern life, like those of Sergei Eisenstein. And in addition to the German writer Bertolt Brecht, who writes about an alienation effect during these decades. Making Strange also has roots in French surrealism and in André Breton's Freudian idea of the uncanny. After World War II, defamiliarizing or making strange takes on a new meaning. Now it's used to control upheaval with the end of a colonial or imperial era, when, particularly in France, most French colonies began to become independent after 1952 and ended in the independence of Algeria in 1962 with the last colony to become independent. So the late 1950s marks an end point for these kinds of books, the end of the colonialist era, and also there's a shift to cultural tumult of the 1960s, the Vietnam era, the civil rights era, and there are protest movements all around the world culminating in 1968. At this point, a new language is needed in photographic books, and the modernist forms that we see during these 4 decades were no longer so successful. So We'll see both in Germany and in France that these photo books in the 4 decades that I cover are enormously important. And a certain amount of work's been done already on the German books, but not so much on the French books. So what I'm trying to do in my book is to show you a deep read of each decade in 4 chapters and a conclusion, each studying one seminal French book and one idea in depth. I'll try to take you on a little bit of a tour today. Several things occurred to make this golden age in France possible between 1928 and 1958. First of all, there's the development of rotogravure, of collotype, and of less expensive offset lithography techniques for photographs. Secondly, many international photographers arrived in Paris from all around the world. And in addition, the explosion of the photographic picture press made it possible for these photographers to find work and to find a venue for their photographs to become visually available. And photographs become a visual currency in the period throughout all the picture magazines. And then finally, there are cultural shifts in the arts that allow a kind of language of fragmentation, which reflects the fast-moving and confusing modern environment that we've seen before. So I'll start with the first chapter on the 1920s, beginning here with Germaine Krull's book Métal, which was published by the Librairie des Arts Décoratifs in 1928. This book was one of the most important photo books of the 1920s, and it was printed in a luxurious printing technique called collotype. You can see the beautiful subtle color tones in the cover image on the left, the kind of rich tones that collotype makes possible. Germaine Krull was a German photographer who came to France via Holland in the mid-1920s, and she was one of the most important machine-age new vision photographers in France. Beginning in Rotterdam in the mid-1920s, she photographed industrial forms as abstractions, partly in collaboration with her partner, the filmmaker Joris Ivens. As the founder of the Filmliga in Holland, an avant-garde group about film, Ivens knew many Soviet avant-garde filmmakers like Sergei Eisenstein, and Krull photographed Eisenstein as early as 1926. Krull and Ivens built on Eisenstein's pioneering ideas of film montage, believing the 2 dissimilar images put together strike a spark to create a powerful third image, different, through the device of the spark or the rupture between them. Both Ivens and Krull made projects of industrial forms gathered in overlapping, fragmented, abstract compositions using this montage technique. After arriving in Paris, Krull published Métal in 1928. This book is not strictly a bound volume. It's a portfolio of disbound images that float freely out of their case, as you can see on the right. And I've included 4 separate plates that sort of are just jumbled and thrown onto the book. The cover itself is a vertiginous view of the Eiffel Tower's elevator wheel, as you see on the left, with Krull's name spilling down the front of the left side, mimicking the shape of the tower. The book is a beautiful object tied together with ribbon, which you can see in the image here. The 64 plates are not labeled, although each one says Krull and Métal with a plate number. You can see that up in the corner down here. This volume is transgressive in multiple ways. The images can be removed, not really common in books. They can be turned upside down. They're reordered easily, as you can see on the right, almost as if they were a deck of cards. All semblance of identity or use has been erased. Instead, Krull assembles a lyrical montage of unidentifiable forms that all sing a song of modern industry. There's a very short text by the critic Florent Fels, editor of the art journal L'Art Vivant. He calls Krull's compositions, quote, sonnets with sharp and luminous rhymes, specimens of a new romanticism. This volume captures the excitement of the late 1920s, when France was finally emerging from World War I. The Eiffel Tower appears in the image on the cover and in 11 more images inside the book, although it's almost always completely abstract, unidentifiable as the 40-year-old tower from the 1889 International World's Fair in Paris. Other images show other unrecognizable fragments, like on the left, a fragment of the lifting bridge called De Hef in Rotterdam, and 9 other images of that same lifting bridge in Rotterdam. Not that you would know it, because all of these images are unlabeled. And it's a good example. You can see, you're not told this is Rotterdam. You're just told the name of the artist, the name of the book, and the plate number. And this is the publisher, Calavat, down here. The album also includes 2 multiple exposures, including one here on the right of bicycle parts superimposed on a colonnaded building, which is featured. Krull's abstractions form a kind of lyrical montage, an optimistic song of industrial fragmentation, and Metal became one of the most influential books of the decade. One example of the power of montage abstraction can be seen in an early book by Walker Evans, the American photographer, in a book called The Bridge, which included the poem by Hart Crane. After a year in Paris from 1926 to 1927, and due to his friendship with Bernice Abbott, who had worked for Man Ray and who brought back Eugene Atget's negatives to the United States shortly after his death, Walker Evans was well aware of European modernist photography. He wrote about critics like Waldemar George, who mentioned Krull, although Evans never mentioned Krull himself. His depictions of the Brooklyn Bridge, like the Eiffel Tower, an 1880s construction that seemed new 40 years later, are abstracted. They use vertiginous angles, and they're inspired by the new vision. And here's one of these abstracted views. There are two views from the Brooklyn Bridge you're looking at here. Evans published these images in an edition of Hart Crane's poem, The Bridge, which is a true collaboration on modern industry by a poet and a photographer. The bridge on the right, although they're very small reproductions, is very similar to Krull's Rotterdam image here on the left. Evans's most famous book is, of course, American Photographs, which was published in 1938 at the time of his Museum of Modern Art show. And it looks physically quite different from Metal, with its clean white page on the left and single image on the right. And I've shown a little detail down in the corner for the layout. But within the images are vestiges of the earlier New Vision image. One image of a parked car here on the right, riffs on car culture in a truly montage experience within one photograph. It's not a multiple exposure like Krull's, but it has an inhabited car in the foreground, a blurred moving truck in the middle ground, an empty parked car behind it, all lined up against a picket fence spanning the background. This is a filmic montage within one image. When we move to the 1930s, in the second chapter of my book, we look at a very different kind of decade, one in the depths of the Depression. Brassai's book Paris de Nuit, or Paris by Night, published in 1932, shows us the secrets of the city at night in poverty, rather than the cacophony of its industrial roaring 20s. Paris de Nuit is another kind of object. It's smaller at about 10 by 7 inches. It's more of a mass production than Krull's. It also came out in an English edition in London in the following year. It's spiral binding, and you can see the spiral binding in both these images here, which was actually the height of fashion in the 1930s. It looks more like a middle school notebook to us today, but it was high style in the 1930s. Paris de Nuit is printed in photogravure, and its inky black pages physically rub off onto your fingers when you hold the book between your hands. The nighttime photographs bleed to the very edge of the pages. There are no neat white pages in this book at all. The new Bifur typeface, designed by Desbeignets and Peignot typeface designers, is actually made by Cassandre, who's a famous graphic designer, and it undulates across the page here, and you can see the word Paris de Nuit making a snake-like pattern across the page. The captions are written by Jean Bernier. The text of the book is written by Paul Morand, who's a well-known French novelist and an author of the nocturnal vignette novels Open at Night and Closed at Night. The flexible binding of Paris de Nuit allows the book to undulate in your hands. Brassai concentrated on the underworld of Paris, as in the bums or clochards gathered around a street trash can fire down here in the bottom right of the image, but he also published views of a more conventional scenes, like the Place de la Concorde on the left. And this page spread shows a sharp contrast between the upper class and the lower class ends of Paris. This chapter is called Dream Detectives, and it shows a mix of popular detective story ideas and high art surrealist dream images of the uncanny based on surrealist writer André Breton and his reading or misreading of Freud. But the most important writer for this decade is actually another person, Pierre-Marc Orlan, a French novelist and critic of photography who coined the term social fantastic to describe the uncanny elements that exist in everyday life. In photographic terms, the social fantastic might be the bridge and its reflection under the water, on the water below, which you see in Brassai's image here, so that they become two round eyes and a nose, a kind of uncanny image. Or the mysterious cyclist police on the left. the swallow police, who are so named for their large black capes. Macquarlon's social fantastic is perfectly illustrated by these two policemen who both defend the peace and ignore the transgressive graffiti written across the public wall behind them. You can see all the graffiti behind you. And there's also this notice, défense, which suggests the defense of the public. And also for anybody who's ever looked at a public building in France, défense d'afficher, which is a sign that's posted on every public building in France still today, according to the law of the 8th of August, 1881. So there's a pun in the image which Brassai makes between the word defense, the defense of the public that these police do, and the transgression of the law, which is happening in writing graffiti right underneath the sign that says post no bills. Mystery stories were hugely popular in this uncomfortable decade. Germaine Krull, the author of Metal, wrote a photo text detective story with a famous detective story writer Georges Simenal in 1931. And the magazine Détective, which you see on the right, was so popular that riots broke out when they hit the newsstands each week. Uncanny encounters, mysterious night wandering, and a dream detective's view of the city all drove photographic books of the 1930s. The unease of the 1930s came to an abrupt halt with the arrival of World War II, and book publishing in Paris more or less ceased when the Germans occupied Paris between 1940 and 1944. Some books, however, tried to create a language to metaphorically make sense of the violence, crisis, and mourning of the French during World War II. And one such book is Pierre Jaon's book, La Mort et les Statues, or Death and the Statues, published in 1946, right after the war. The book documents bronze statues toppled and melted down for German ammunition in 1941, which Pierre Jaon photographed surreptitiously one December morning during the German occupation. The book was published only after the war, with a short introduction and poetic captions by Jean Cocteau. Also printed in gravure, like Paris de Nuit, it similarly uses a modernist typeface, this one called Peignot. Both Jaon and Cocteau had complicated relationships with the French and the Germans under occupation, as did many others who had to survive the years of occupation while attempting to resist. Cocteau's is an even more complicated story, but that's a story for another day. By showing statues about to be melted down as if they were people, Jaon allows these damaged and destroyed bronze figures to stand in for actual human corpses. Any question about this is put to rest by Cocteau's poetic caption of the drummer, the tambour here. The caption reads, "This murdered drummer did not know the shock of battle or stakes through his boots, but his drum knew how to defend his flesh, and it still beats the charge." In another image, a group of mangled alligators removed from the group Triumph of the Republic in the Place de la Nation symbolizes the anguish and loss of occupied Paris, of the gas chambers, of the atomic bombs. This is 1946 when it's finally published, after all, far beyond the single melted statue. Marianne, who is the central figure in this group and a symbol of the French Revolution, had escaped demolition from the sculptural group. She was deemed too central a figure to melt down. Poor alligators, on the other hand, didn't have any such luck. Cocteau's caption, "Rome capitulates," refers to a greater loss than just a French one, and it also reverberates with Francophone identity with classical European culture. In the absence or unspeakability of France's losses, these images stand in as what historian Pierre Nora calls a place of memory, or a lieu de mémoire, an imaginary site of memory because there are no real environments. Jaon clearly loved these destroyed alligators. 5 of the 20 images in his book depict them, and here are 2 more. Depicting the dead in Buchenwald and other concentration camps, especially since the French were somewhat complicit in deportations during the war, would not serve here for a French audience where resistors and collaborators were trying to redefine post-war France. So a larger metaphorical statement of loss and anguish exists instead in this beautifully constructed and designed book that's an elegy about war and loss. Then I have the 4th chapter, which moves to the 1950s. And in 1952, Henri Cartier-Bresson published the book Images à la Sauvette on the left, with an English edition called The Decisive Moment. And 3 years later, in 1955, he published The Europeans. They're both published simultaneously in Paris and in New York, again, international publications. With their simultaneous editions and with their covers designed by Matisse on the left and Miro on the right, they seem to present Cartier-Bresson as a master artist, a reputation cemented by his 1947 Museum of Modern Art exhibition, a one-man show. Many thought The Decisive Moment to be the most powerful photo book of the decade, but it too has a cultural meaning that goes far beyond the formal portfolio interpretation it's often given as Cartier-Bresson's most famous book. These books tell surprisingly conservative and nostalgic stories about the Cold War for a photographer who'd been a war hero and a prisoner of war himself. It fits into a period when France was faced with a loss of its national identity after the German occupation, and also with a loss of its enormous colonial empire, with colonies becoming independent almost every day. These books fit into the slippery French tradition of humanistic photography in France, which normalizes French and European mores in the face of external pressures. Cartier-Bresson's books actively work to reconstruct a notion of what it means to be European at a time of great geopolitical tensions. This can best be seen in the layout of Image à la Sauvette, or The Decisive Moment, and I'm showing you here the first image of the book and the first image of the second half. The first half of the book is labeled Occident in the American edition, and it begins with an image which is about as quintessentially French as an image could be, depicting a bridal couple in a French suburb. The viewer is immediately lifted up by the diagonal rise of the bride's swing, her joyous laugh, and the corresponding smile on the groom's face. Against this movement and the freedom of her body in space, we see the solidity of family members in the background. Together, individuality, joy, and communal structure reaffirm French identity and democratic rule. The second half of the book is titled Orient in the American edition, and it begins with a very different image, which is the one you see on the right. It similarly depicts two figures, both women, but although they are also clad in white, these women are faceless. The photo is joyless and static. The caption reads, Western Pakistan, 1948. Two ladies in purdah at a bar where war surplus parachutes are being sold for clothing material. Cartier-Bresson frames these women from the back, surrounded on either side by the long white lengths of knotted parachute cloth. In fact, Cartier-Bresson has framed, quote, 4 ladies in purdah, 2 standing and 2 hanging like hooks, hanging from hooks like meat in a meat market. Although Cartier-Bresson was the magnum agent in Asia during these years, covering many revolutions, the Orient he photographs in this book shows a vast difference from European culture, and he portrays it as flatter, more static, and less individualistic. Another double-page spread from the second half of this book shows how Cartier-Bresson flattens out his Asian subject. This Chinese scene from Shanghai in 1948 is like a frieze in a sculpture or a shallow stage set. It is, in fact, a rush on the bank in Shanghai shortly before the Communist Revolution. 10 people were crushed to death here, but you don't get a sense of that in the photograph. These large dual-page images, and again, The Decisive Moment is enormous to begin with. It is, hang on, let me find the size. 14 inches tall by almost 11 inches wide, and this is a double image. So it's 23 inches wide by 14 inches tall. It's a big image that you're looking at. But these images formally cage and decontextualize the very serious political events that they represent, despite the informative captions that give more political details than the images themselves. Cartier-Bresson is not the only photographer in France who participated in constructing Europe as a post-war center of the world, while framing the rest of the world as lesser, other, and culturally different from that European center. The same year as Cartier-Bresson's Image à la Sauvette, or The Decisive Moment, Robert Delpierre published a book of Robert Frank's photographs of Peru, taken on his 1948 trip there. We saw at the beginning of this lecture that Frank's French version of his famous book, Les Américains, was structured as an anthropology lesson. One might think that this was an anomaly, that Frank soon got the book the way he wanted it without those pesky text inserts. But his earlier book, Indians of the High Plateau, or Indiens des Hauts Plateaux, is even more Europeanizing than the Americans. In this volume, there are 26 Robert Frank pictures and a text by Georges Arnaud, who had written a popular novel about his book, about his 3 years in the Andes. The images and captions convey a European colonialist message of a hopeless and powerless other. The cover of the volume shows us figures whose well-worn hats echo the ridges and the bumps of the Andes Mountains behind them, creating a composition where the heads and hilltops are equally timeless and undulating. The interior spreads on the right show this even more. On the left, children move towards the bottom left frame or bottom left corner of the page, accompanied by a caption, quote, "and they will have to go elsewhere." And on the right, two Andean women wear European-style hats and look sadly away from the children towards the opposite corner, accompanied by Arnold's shockingly Orientalist caption, "Faces of the East," never mind that this is Peru, it's not the Far East, "Faces of the East, faces of senile wisdom who wait for nothing at all." Robert Frank, Samaritans, continues in that tradition. In the later 1950s, Frank and another photographer named William Klein do something different. Robert Frank uses grainy images to depict gritty realities, both in Peru and in America. And other photographers working in the later 1950s also used the formal tools of photography itself: dust mites, scratches on negatives, grainy over enlarged images in order to comment on photography. William Klein was born in the United States and stationed in Europe as a young soldier just after World War II. Like Frank, he was too young to fight. He settled in Paris for the rest of his life and still lives there today. First, he studied with Léger and worked later as a graphic designer for Vogue. After 6 months in New York in 1954, he published his book in 1956 with Seuil Press in Paris. It's called Life is Good and Good for You, Trance Witness Rebels. It too had international editions in Paris, in Milan, and in London. In some ways, Klein's book returns to the abstraction, montage, and film-based principles of Krull's Metal, but it's more ironic, more disturbing, and less lyrical. It bears almost no formal resemblance to the French humanist tradition, instead creating a volatile mix of montage and celebration of the transgressions of urban life. This page spread of the dance in Brooklyn shows the graininess of Klein's style, the intentional mockery of norms, and Klein's parodying of everyday life. So rather than the social fantastic, which Père Marc Orlan celebrated in the 1930s, this is more of a parody. The next Klein page spread I'm showing you here shows the direct violence of American culture and breaks the fourth wall of the cinematic practice. The grimacing boy on the left, unforgettably aims his gun right at us. And other children also shoot weapons with no regard for normal behavior. Klein's montage owes a lot to Krull's book Metal. His look at the underworld reflects Brassai's fascination with the underworld as well. And the metaphor for violence and war is something not so dissimilar from Jaron's book La Mort et les Statues. But in this case, in Klein's case, violence has become an act of violence with a juvenile thug rather than anything more war-related. Klein himself was full of mockery, later writing that he searched, quote, for content, for pseudo-ethnography, parody, and data. "I was a make-believe ethnograph," he wrote. And he says, "The resulting book went against the grain 40 years ago. My approach wasn't fashionable then, and it isn't now either." Frank tried to be a European anthropologist in Cold War America. Klein, on the other hand, mocked the whole idea. The highly stylized book productions of Krull, Brassai, Germaine, and Cartier-Bresson were passing out of fashion by the late 1950s. But this last group of Paris-made photo books, Frank's Les Américains and Klein's Life is Good and Good for You, had a huge impact in Japan in the following decade. The graininess, grittiness, and disregard for norms that Frank and Klein pioneered became a powerful language for Japanese protest photography in the 1960s, as can be seen in this final image from Daido Moriyama's book, Bye Bye Photography, that shows us only the grain, the scratches, and the film sprockets, and almost erases the urban scene in Tokyo that it tries to depict. Violence towards the photographic image itself has become a tool of protest, but Moriyama couldn't have made these images or this book without the strong influence of Brassai, who was revered in France as early as 1933, of Frank or of Klein. These Paris photo books had traveled halfway around the world and through half a century. And then there's one final comment in closing. Oddly, all of these books have been recently reprinted in new facsimiles, reeditions. So I don't know why there's a renewed interest in them, but I'm thrilled to know it and to hope that they'll be more available widely to all of you if you're interested in the books I've introduced to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Kim. That was great.
Okay.
We do have questions, so
Great.
I will just open this up and read them to you.
Okay, sounds like a plan.
Okay, so the first one from Jason Lance. I hope it's okay to identify you, but I'm thinking Kim might know some of you and want to know. Say hi. William Klein tells the story of Chris Marker championing New York, even threatening to quit if Editions du Seuil didn't publish it. Not to mention that it was Marker's small format illustrated travel guide series that sent Klein to Seuil in the first place. In this context, I wonder more how the photo books you've looked at tied into the larger catalogs of their respective publishing houses, and would more generally be interested to hear more about the photo book as a collaborative effort.
Okay, well, the photo publishing houses are enormously important, and Seuil is a really important publishing house with Marker's efforts later as a filmmaker and then as a publisher. And in the longer book, if you read the book, I do talk a lot about the publishing houses. Delpierre is a force unto himself, and the whole long tradition of publishing that he did, culminating in the late 1950s and going much later than that, is really important. And the publishing house that published Paris de Nuit in the 1930s is also, it's called Art et Métier Graphique, and it also publishes an annual about design and photography in the 1930s. And in the 1920s, the book publisher, the Édition des Arts Décoratifs that did Krull's book, also did a series of kinds of modernist portfolio type images in the same format where you have beautiful books tied in portfolio type forms, sometimes of African textiles, sometimes of other people. So it's really important to look at the history of all of the publishing houses in depth. This is a little bit of a taste, a smorgasbord, just a chance to taste a few examples of each of those. But I do write about that more fully in my book.
That is a good segue. Britt says, thanks you for the fascinating presentation, and wonders if you could speak about your process for narrowing to these specific photo books in France during this period. Were there any photo books that you were sorry to not include in detail in the book?
Well, each chapter doesn't actually only look at one book, it looks at several books. So in the Krull chapter, for instance, I also talk about Moiver's enormously important book, Paris, that's published in 1930 or 1931. So there are other books that are included as well. For the purposes of this talk, I narrowed it down so that I'm just talking about one book at a time. I did have to narrow down the topics more or less. Sometimes they were fairly obvious. Krull's book is by far the most famous book in the 1920s. Brassai's Paris de Nuit stands above all the others. The war chapter was a little bit more complicated. Probably the most famous and widest publication of a book is called Paris Under the Boot of the Nazis, and I write about that book as well. It's not really an avant-garde book in the same way, but it had an enormous impact. And for Cartier-Bresson, in my book, I actually talked not just about the Decisive Moment, but about 4 books Cartier-Bresson published during that decade. 2 of them more photojournalistic books, one on Moscow and one on China, and then the Europeans and the Decisive Moment. That's the other one. So there's a certain amount of narrowing down. There are books published that give an encyclopedic overview of great photo books. But what I really wanted to do was dig deeply into the cultural history behind each one of these books. So I chose carefully, and there are a few other examples in each chapter as well.
Susan Laxton asks if you would speak a bit about the French title of Cartier-Bresson's book and the connotation of savagery implied by the word sauvette. Is it possible that Cartier-Bresson was invoking a double meaning that had disappeared in the American translation?
There's a lot of ink spilled on the meaning of the French title, Image à la sauvette, and there's also a lot of discussion where the term actually comes from. Images taken on the fly, images taken, sauvette is not so much wilderness as the idea of on the, taken in a hurry or as a snapshot. So there was a lot of writing, actually interesting writing back and forth between Thériault in Paris and Richard Simon of Simon and Schuster in New York, who are the French and American publishers of the book, about what the book should be called. And Cartier-Bresson, particularly for the American edition, didn't really have as much say as he would have liked. So there are a lot of, and I think a cousin, I can't remember exactly off the top of my head, but somebody came up with that term of image à la sauvette. And it seemed to capture several different things which Cartier-Bresson thought were fitting. One, imagine a bookstall seller who doesn't have a license selling his books along, and then along the side of the road, and the police come and he has to pack everything up and run away. So there's a sense that you're capturing an image almost in transgression of the rules. And that he liked a lot as a notion. And then images made on the fly, because of course it's a snapshot kind of aesthetic, using a Leica camera. And the Leica camera is a small camera, a 35mm camera that can capture images quickly and capture motion as well. And there's several other sort of layerings of meaning of pictures taken in that kind of fashion. So a lot of people have thought about the multiple meanings. I'm not sure it would be that first meaning though. Okay.
Yep.
It's hard not to see the faces of people who are asking.
I know, it's hard.
But thank you for these questions. They're great.
Terry Tafford has a question about the clock or weight on the right side of Cartier-Bresson's photo with the bride on the swing. You might have
at the clock. All right.
Clock or a weight.
Just a moment.
I have to look to.
I have to go back and find it and look for it myself. Oh, wait a second. Cartier-Bresson's clock.
Or perhaps a weight.
All right, just a second. You want me to share the image again? I can do that.
If you can, that would be great.
Okay, let me share my screen. Share the screen and.
Oh, yes. Looks like a scale, maybe.
Current slide. It's the scale for weighing fabric, I think, which is even more unnerving because of the notion that, maybe these women are going to be weighed and sold as well.
Yep. Ugh.
Yeah. Okay.
Yep.
Stop sharing.
Christine Halt-Lewis. Hi, Christine.
Hi, Christine.
Fantastic overview of a really wonderful book. Do you have any sense of how popular these books were with the general public in their own time? I know the Americans didn't really catch fire for about a decade, but what about the others?
Okay. Metal is advertised in all of the major sort of, art for New Yorkerish type journals in France in the late 1920s, and it got a lot of press coverage. So it was very well received during the time. It dropped out of favor later on, and she left Europe in 1939, and she wasn't around to promote her own career. But you can grudgingly find in the literature people like Man Ray saying, there were two really important photographers in France in the late 1920s, and I was one, and Germaine Krull was the other. So it was very well known. But it was somewhat expensive still. But Paris de Nuit was a bestseller. It was published the next year in English. It was in all the bookstores. And if you can believe Brassai's somewhat over-enthusiastic evaluation of his own work, he wrote letters home to his parents saying, every bookstore in Paris had it. There's piles of books everywhere. So it had a much larger impact than the Americans did. The Americans had no impact really of that sort in France. And you're right, and the Americans in the United States didn't have such a big impact as well. La Mort et les Statues was a smaller production with a smaller reception. And Cartier-Bresson's book was received less widely in the United States than you think it would have been. There's also a lot of really interesting commentary when the book first came out. The representatives who sold the book to each bookstore around the country, the distributors, kept saying, how am I going to sell this book that's got Matisse on the cover and pictures inside? It's some sort of a hybrid. It's not either one or the other. So it sort of gradually also gained a kind of reputation. Took a little while there too. But Brassai's book was very popular right away. Thanks.
A question from Carlos. Certainly these books represented the fine artwork of film photography and the making of a print. Is there any future for film photography today? What is the place of documentary photography in the digital age?
I think photography is alive and well. That's just my personal view. And film photography or digital photography, that ends up being a kind of an aesthetic choice on the part of the person making the image. And what's interesting is that there are some printing techniques returning. Like 19th century printing techniques like collodion prints are becoming popular again. Ali, you would know about that. You're finding contemporary photographers making tintypes, making collodion negatives again. And even the printing processes for books like photogravure are starting to be recognized as something more interesting, perhaps. So they're getting a new world, maybe in the art world, not so much in the commercial world. Yeah.
And that is it for our questions.
Okay. Well, thanks very much. It's a pleasure to talk about these books with all of you today.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. Thank you, Ellie. And I hope everyone gets a chance to see the show, which is just spectacular.
Yes, please come if you can, up through April 11th, so plenty of time, assuming the world goes forward.
All right. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
All right. Bye.
Bye.